Every man on this road watched her load that pipe. Not one of them asked why. That was the summer of 2012, and the drought had already eaten through the patience of every farmer in Hardeman County before it got around to eating through the crops. The sky had been the same color for 6 weeks, a pale bleached-out white that wasn't quite cloud and wasn't quite sun, just heat diffused so evenly across the horizon that there was no shade anywhere, not even under the pecan trees along the creek road, where the leaves had started curling at the edges the way paper curls near a fire. The Hatchie ran low and brown between its banks. The pond at the bottom of the Hallett property still held water fed by whatever underground thread kept it alive in dry years. But the upper fields told a different story, and anyone who drove the county roads in July could read it without stopping. Hallett Farm sat 40 acres on the river bottom edge of the county, the kind of land a family holds on to, not because it's easy, but because holding on is the only language left. Garrett Hallett's great-grandfather had cleared the worst of it with a borrowed mule, and 4 years of mornings he never talked about. Every generation since had bent itself to the same ground, the same seasons, the same calculation of rain against debt, against seed prices that never moved in the direction you needed. The house was white clapboard with a tin roof that amplified every rainstorm into something that sounded like applause. And in dry years, the silence on that roof was its own kind of announcement. The porch ran the full width of the front. The swing still held. The boards had been reinforced twice, and nobody in the house thought of it as neglect. It was maintenance deferred, which was different, and the difference mattered to people who understood the arithmetic of a working farm. Garrett was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent those years asking his body to do things it hadn't been designed for. His hands were large and deliberate. He had a way of wiping them on the rag at his belt, even when they weren't dirty, a habit his wife Dottie had long since stopped remarking on. He grew soybeans and corn on the bottom ground, and in years when the price made the misery worthwhile, a strip of tobacco on the higher elevation on the north end of the property. What the family called the upper field, where the soil ran sandy and the water moved through it too quickly to do anything useful. That field had been a problem as long as the Halletts had farmed this ground. In a wet year, you could hide that fact. In the third dry summer in a row, there was nothing to hide it behind. The soybeans in the upper field had started pale in June. By July, they were something worse than pale, the leaves curling at the edges, in that specific way a plant curls when it has stopped hoping for rain and started rationing what's already inside it. Garrett had walked the rows twice in the first week of July, pressing 2 fingers into the soil between the plants, reading the ground the way he read everything through his hands. He'd stood at the end of the row a long time without saying anything. When he came back to the house that evening, he did not mention the upper field at supper. Dottie noticed. Dottie noticed most things, though she had the particular wisdom of a woman who understood when noticing something out loud only added weight to a room that was already heavy. She kept a kitchen garden of genuine ambition tomatoes staked on cedar poles. She cut herself peppers and squash and 2 long runs of pole beans strung up on wire salvaged from a fence repair 4 years back. The garden produced more than the family needed, and she put up the rest. And the pantry shelf of labeled jars was in its own quiet way, the thing that had kept the household from the worst kind of panic in the lean years. She was a practical woman with a warm instinct she applied selectively. She had learned not to speak the words she was thinking when Garrett came home from the upper field with that particular set to his jaw. The money conversation happened after the lights went out. Wren heard it through the wall, not the words so much as the register, that flat, careful frequency her parents' voices dropped into when the subject was the kind that couldn't be raised at the table. She heard the word loan once then again. She lay in the dark on her back with her hands flat on her stomach and listened to the sound of her parents trying not to sound afraid, which is its own kind of sound, distinct and unmistakable to a child who has learned to read the temperature of a house by its silences. Wren Hallett was 13 years old that summer, the middle of 3 children. In the specific way that middle children develop when the older one fills a role with precision and the younger one fills the remaining space with charm, she had found herself in a position no one had assigned her. Cord, her older brother, was 16 and built along his father's lines, broad through the shoulders, easy with engines. The kind of boy who could look at a machine and identify its problem with the same calm certainty other people applied to obvious things. He was the one Garrett called when the header threw a belt or the irrigation pump lost pressure. He was the one who came back from the shed with grease on his hands and a solution, and this had given him a standing in the household that had nothing to do with anyone meaning to be unfair. It was just the shape the family had taken. The way families take shapes over years without anyone deciding on them. Lena was 8 and occupied a different category altogether, young enough that the farm was still primarily a place of adventure, old enough to be underfoot in a useful way when she chose to be. She had her mother's instinct for attaching herself to whatever mattered most at any given moment. What mattered most to her that summer was Wren, for reasons Lena couldn't have articulated, but which Wren understood perfectly well. The way younger siblings sometimes understand the one they've chosen as their anchor without being able to explain the choosing. Wren read. That was the shorthand in the house, not said unkindly, but said often enough that she'd absorbed it as a fact of her own description, the one who reads. She kept a stack of books on the floor beside her bed and a notebook gone soft at the corners in which she wrote things. She wanted to remember fragments from what she'd read. Observations she made about the land that she'd learned not to say out loud because no one had asked for them. She had her mother's brown hair, her grandmother Vera's economy of expression, that quality of saying less than she was thinking and watching more than she spoke. In a house that measured contribution in horsepower and harvest weight, this had not historically been the kind of currency that spent. Vera Hallett lived in a small room off the back of the farmhouse that had once been a sun porch and had been insulated and closed in sometime in the 1970s, a project Garrett's father had undertaken with more ambition than skill. So the room was warm in winter and warm in summer. Vera had stopped complaining about it somewhere around the age of 75. She was 81 now, spending her mornings at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, going cold at her elbow, and a stack of agricultural extension pamphlets she'd been accumulating since before Garrett was born. She read them the way other people read novels, slowly more than once, and she had a particular relationship with information that Wren had always found more comfortable than the way most adults treated what they knew, as if knowing something obligated you to announce it. Vera held her knowledge the way she held her coffee cup, close and without ceremony. Garrett had taken cord to the equipment shed the morning Wren grabbed the wrong wrench. It was a small thing. The combine had thrown a belt. Garrett had his head down in the engine compartment, with one hand out, called for a 3/4 without looking up, and Wren was closest to the bench. She picked up what she thought he meant, put it in his open palm. He felt the size of it, set it down without comment, called Cord's name toward the house. Cord had come out and reached past Wren for the right wrench and handed it over, and the two of them had gone back to work. And Wren had walked to the porch steps and picked up the pamphlet she'd left face down on the wood and read the same half page 3 times without seeing any of it. Her ears had gone hot in the way she recognized. The thing that settled in her afterward wasn't anger. She'd gotten practiced enough with the shape of that particular afternoon to know it wasn't anger. It was flatter than that, more durable. The feeling of standing in a room where the furniture has been arranged around a space that's the exact size and shape of you, but not for you. She kept 12 hens in a run behind the barn. That was hers, had been hers since she was 9, when Garrett had made clear that if she wanted something to call her own, she was going to have to earn the right to call it that. She'd started with 4 pullets in a feed bucket, and the stubbornness that sometimes looks like patience from the outside. By the summer she was 13, she had 12 hens producing steadily, a coffee can under a loose board in her bedroom floor, with money in it that no one in the house knew the exact amount of, except her. Holt Rigsby came out from the county extension office twice before the middle of July. He was a careful, organized man who carried a clipboard and wore the expression of someone who had delivered the same information to enough failing farms that the delivering had become its own kind of grief-worn smooth. He walked the upper field, both times crouched over the plants, pressed the soil, did the calculations Garrett had already done. On his second visit, he stood at the end of the row, clicked his pen and said the recommendation was more frequent, irrigation and mulching around the base of the plants to retain moisture. He said it without any particular change in his voice. Garrett thanked him and walked him to his truck. After the truck was gone, Garrett stood in the driveway looking at the upper field before going back to the shed. Wren had been standing 20 feet back from the row when Rigsby made his recommendation, close enough to hear, far enough to be invisible, a position she had refined over years of practice. She heard every word. She also watched the direction Rigsby's eyes didn't go down the slope, toward the low crease in the north shoulder of the property that the family called the draw. Everyone called it the draw, a shallow concavity in the land where rainwater collected after a storm and sat for 2 or 3 days before soaking away. The family had been walking past it her entire life without giving it particular attention because it had no practical application. Anyone had thought of it sat below the dying field, useless to the dying field, by the basic physics of water moving from high to low. What Wren had noticed that summer was something she'd been looking at for weeks without knowing what she was seeing. It started with the grass. The bottom of the draw was green, not the pale, struggling green of pasture grass that had been surviving on borrowed time since May, a low, stubborn, deep-down green that had no business being there in the third dry summer of a drought when everything around it had gone the color of old straw. She'd been watching it since June, telling herself it was shade from the slope or runoff pattern from the last rain. But the shade argument didn't hold because the draw didn't have significant shade. The runoff argument didn't hold because it hadn't rained in 3 weeks and the grass was still green. She'd run out of easy explanations somewhere around the second week of July, and what was left wasn't an explanation at all. It was a question. She went down there on a Tuesday afternoon in the hottest week of the month when the rest of the family was occupied, and her absence would go unnoticed. She crouched at the bottom of the draw and pressed her hand flat against the grass, and the ground there was cool. Not just cooler than the hillside, actually cool with the specific temperature of soil that has water in it. She dug a hole with her hand 6 inches 8 and held the displaced dirt in her palm. It was damp. She pressed the sides of the hole and felt it give a slow release of moisture from somewhere below. She came back 4 hours later when the light was going orange over the upper field. Water stood in the hole, less than an inch, but standing, which meant it had come from somewhere while she was gone. She filled the hole back in and walked to the house. She didn't tell anyone. That was important, though she couldn't have said exactly why, except that she understood by instinct that a discovery which belongs to you stops belonging to you the moment you hand it to someone else to evaluate. She'd handed things to people to evaluate before. She knew what came back. She sat on the back steps with her notebook and a stub of pencil and wrote down what she'd found. Then she sat for a long time looking at the upper field doing arithmetic she didn't have all the numbers for yet. The thing she did have was this: the bottom of the draw sat higher on the slope than the upper field. She'd been too close to it her whole life to see it clearly the way you can be too close to a hill to understand it's a hill. But from a certain angle from where Rigsby had stood talking about mulch, she could see that the draw wasn't below the dying field. It was above it. She got the number 2 days later with a length of string and a carpenter's level borrowed from the shed on a morning Garrett and cord were out on the tractor. She strung it from the lip of the draw down the slope toward the head of the upper field, checking level every 10 feet, writing in her notebook in the same careful hand she used for everything she expected to need later. 9 feet. The bottom of the draw sat 9 vertical feet above the first row of dying soybeans. That number sat in her chest for the rest of the day, like a stone being warmed. She'd been reading Vera's pamphlets for 2 weeks by then. That had started on a morning she'd come into the kitchen early to find a stack on the table. The top one folded open to a diagram showing something called a gravity-fed drip line. Water moving through a narrow hose with emitter holes spaced at measured intervals, fed by a collection point elevated above the field it watered. No pump, no diesel, no electricity. Wren had stood in this kitchen doorway looking at that diagram for a full minute before she pulled the chair out and sat down. Vera had been at the far end of the table with her coffee, not reading, not watching, occupying the room with the particular stillness of someone who has arranged things and now intends to let them do their work. Wren read that pamphlet to the end, set it face down, picked up the next one. The system in the diagram needed only one thing she didn't yet know: she had a starting point higher than the ending point, connected by a line that didn't leak. 9 feet, she thought again. That's enough. She didn't say it out loud. She read the section on emitter spacing twice, then the section on mainline diameter, which she skimmed because it didn't mean anything to her yet. She would come back to that page. It would cost her 2 failed attempts and a significant amount of time on her knees in the dirt before she understood what she'd missed. The pipe problem was practical. A system like she was imagining needed more pipe than a coffee can of egg money could buy at the farm supply store more than she had any other way of getting. She sat with that constraint for 2 evenings before she arrived at the solution, with the particular satisfaction of a person who has figured something out by thinking rather than by being told. The county had been throwing pipe away for years. She'd seen it rusting in the weeds along every dirt road in the neighborhood, lengths of aluminum irrigation, lateral PVC couplings gone green with age fittings, piled beside barns, the way old machinery accumulates when the cost of hauling it off exceeds the energy required to ignore it. She went on Saturday mornings before the heat came up serious. She had a wagon her father had built years back out of 2x4s and old bicycle wheels intended for hauling feed, and she pulled it behind her bicycle along the roads east of the farm. She stopped wherever she saw what she was looking for, laid her bike in the ditch, walked up to the house, knocked, asked politely if she could take the old pipe off their hands. Every man on this road watched her load that pipe. Not one of them asked why. They said yes, all of them without hesitation. The pipe was nothing to them, had been nothing for years, been sitting there rusting because no one had gotten around to burning it, and probably no one would. A 13-year-old girl asking to take it away was sufficient excuse to stop thinking about it. They told her to help herself, watch from their porch rails as she dragged lengths of aluminum out of the weeds and wrestled them into the wagon and lashed them down with bungee cords she'd had the foresight to bring. A few of them laughed, not cruel, just baffled, the sound people make when they see something happening with obvious conviction and can't find a reason to discourage it. One called after her as she pedaled out of his driveway. "What's a girl want with a load of junk that didn't work the first time somebody threw it out?" She lifted a hand and kept pedaling. Cord noticed by the second Saturday. He was standing in the barn door when she came back with the wagon loaded, watching her unload and stack the pipe in the order she was developing, by diameter and condition, the way you organize material you intend to use with precision. He looked at the stack, already larger than a first-time observer might expect. He looked at his sister's face, which was not inviting comment. "Dad needs somebody in the shed this afternoon." The voice of a reminder delivered as neutral fact. "You're out here playing with pipe somebody already threw away." She kept stacking. "I'll be done soon." "It didn't work the first time, whoever's it was." He paused, looking at the pipe. "Probably didn't work the second time either. That's why it's in the ditch." She set down a length of aluminum and looked at him with the unhurried thoroughness she'd inherited from Vera. Cord held it for 2 seconds, then went back inside. Lena appeared at Wren's elbow without announcement, her method. She was wearing barn boots with a sundress, a combination she was committed to regardless of context. She crouched and put her hand on one of the aluminum sections, the way you'd examine something at a market stall. "Why's it all bent?" "Someone drove over it," Wren said. "Can you fix bent? Some of it?" Wren picked up the next length and checked it against the one she'd just set down. "The rest I'll figure out." Lena settled herself cross-legged in the dirt beside the wagon and prepared to assist, which in practice meant handing Wren things when asked and studying everything with the focused attention of a child who has decided this is where the interesting things are happening. Wren didn't ask her to leave. It was warm out. The company was uncomplicated. It was on the third Saturday, coming back with the heaviest load yet, that Wren found Vera watching from the back porch. The old woman sat in the cane chair she preferred, armrests worn to a shine from 30 years of use, with her coffee going cold at her elbow. She watched Wren unload the wagon without speaking until the last piece was stacked. "What are you building?" Vera's voice was the same in the morning and the afternoon, dry and unhurried. Wren thought about what to say. "Something that lets water fall where it needs to go." Vera looked at her a moment. "Not push it." "No, ma'am." Vera nodded once and picked up her coffee and looked away at the upper field in the distance. She didn't ask more questions that afternoon, but the next morning when Wren came into the kitchen before anyone else was up there, was a new stack of pamphlets on the table. The top one was open to a page on elevation differentials and pipe gradient calculations. In the margin, in a slow, careful hand that wasn't Vera's, an older hand, a man's, penciled in 40 years back in ink that had faded but not disappeared, someone had written a number and a note. Wren sat down slowly. The writing said, "Seep at the draw, 1983 clay floor, holds check depth after rain." Beneath it, a simple calculation feat of fall times 0.43 equals pounds per square inch available. She looked at the pamphlet for a long time. The year in the margin was the year before her father was born. The hand was her grandfather's, Vera's husband, a man Wren knew only from one photograph on the hallway wall. A square-shouldered man standing at the edge of a field, with his arm over the hood of a tractor, squinting at something off to the side of the camera, with an expression that said he was thinking about something more interesting than having his picture taken. She looked up. Vera was in the doorway with her coffee. His, Wren said, not a question. Vera came to the table, sat across from her, folded her hands around her cup. She had a way of letting the air in a room settle before she spoke, a form of respect Wren had always understood for the weight of what was about to be said. He was a careful man, Vera said at last. Careful with the land, careful with his time. He would have read everything in that stack 2 or 3 times before he tried anything. She looked at the pamphlet. He did read everything in that stack. I watched him. Wren looked back at the handwriting. The calculation was clean, precise. He noticed the seep. He noticed everything about that draw. Vera's voice didn't change. The summer of 1983. We'd had 2 dry years running, and the upper field was giving us the same trouble it always did. He spent the spring reading the early summer measuring. A pause. I'm going to stop there for now because the rest of that story has a place to be told, and this isn't it yet. She pressed one fingertip to the margin note. But you should know someone already confirmed that seep is real. Someone who knew what he was looking for. Wren did the calculation again with her own number. His note assumed 4 feet of fall. She had 9 more than twice the pressure he'd worked with. She wrote her measurement in the margin below his, adding her number to the column in pencil. Small, careful letters. Her own hand below his. Vera watched her write. Something moved across the old woman's face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite sadness, something that happened at the intersection of both. She left the whole stack on the table when she went back to her room, and this time she didn't take any of it with her. That evening, Wren went back to the draw with her notebook. She stood at the lip of it in the long, slanted light and looked down the slope toward the first row of the upper field. She read the land the way she'd been reading it all summer, the color of the soil where it caught the last light, the angle of the shadows where the grade changed, the green at the bottom of the draw against the straw-colored pasture around it, a difference in color so obvious now that she couldn't understand how she'd ever explained it away. She stood there until the light went orange, then pink, then flat. What she didn't know yet, standing in that late light with her notebook and her new number, and the beginning of a plan that was still more intuition than blueprint, was why her father said what he said about the upper field, every time the subject came up, always in the same words. That high ground's been beating this family since before I was born. Some ground just wins. She'd heard it so many times it had started to feel like weather, like something that arrived each season without origin. She didn't know yet that those words had an origin, that they'd been handed to him by his father's silence in a specific summer she now had a date for. She didn't know what 1983 had looked like from a 12-year-old boy's angle of view. She would know eventually. But that part of the story was still inside Vera, where Vera intended to keep it until the time was right. What Wren knew standing there in the draw in the last of the evening light was simpler. She had water. She had elevation. She had a calculation in 2 different handwritings in the margin of a pamphlet that confirmed the physics were real. She had a stack of salvaged pipe behind the barn, and a summer's worth of egg money, and a sister who had appointed herself chief observer and wasn't going to stop. She had almost everything she needed. She walked back up the slope toward the house, notebook under her arm, boots dark with the damp soil from the bottom of the draw, thinking, I'm not going to push it up. I'm going to let it fall. It was the clearest thought she'd had since June. It felt the way a correct thought sometimes feels, like something that had been true for a long time waiting for her to catch up to it. Lena was sitting on the back steps when Wren came through the gate already in her nightgown, hair loose, holding up a length of black drip tape from the barn. I was guarding it. Wren sat down beside her. Good, she said. It's the most important piece. Lena leaned against her shoulder, uncomplicated. Above them, the tin roof ticked as it cooled from the day. The upper field was invisible now in the dark, just a direction, just a fact. Wren sat there and for a minute let herself be 13 years old, and the night held all of it without comment. She started digging before the house woke up. The alarm she set was for 4:30. The first morning she went out, she stood in the yard in the dark, orienting herself by Shape's barn roof against sky fence line. The upper field, a long horizontal darkness at the top of the slope. The temperature at that hour was still bearable. By 8, it would not be. She'd worked out the arithmetic of the summer heat the same way she'd worked out the arithmetic of the water pressure practically without sentiment. Early hours were the only hours available to her, and she intended to use them. She had a garden spade and a measuring rod she'd cut from a straight length of scrap pine marked in 6-inch intervals with permanent marker. She'd drawn the route in her notebook the night before the main line running from the collector basin she planned to dig at the foot of the seep down the 9 feet of slope, then branching along the first rows of the upper field. On the ground, it was going to be messier. She started anyway. The first trench ran from the lip of the draw to the point where the slope leveled into the upper field. 63 feet she'd measured that afternoon. She cut it 4 inches deep enough to seat the main line with stability pipe that moved, shifted the angle of the joints, and the joints were where everything would either hold or fail. She'd read that in the installation pamphlet and understood it as more than abstract advice. She took her time with the depth, even when the spade hit a root and she had to go around it. She worked until the light was full enough to see, without squinting, then returned to the house for breakfast before anyone had come to find her. Vera was up, as Vera always was, coffee at the table. She didn't look at Wren's boots or ask where she'd been. She pushed the sugar bowl slightly in Wren's direction, as close as she came to hospitality before 7 in the morning. Garrett came through the kitchen while Wren was finishing her water and paused at the counter for his coffee without looking at her. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Wren said, which was true in the way that true things are true when you pick the right angle. He poured his coffee and went out to the shed. She heard the truck start a few minutes later. She went back out and kept digging. By the end of the first week, she had the main line trench complete, and 2 branch lines started cut into the soil between the plants, with care taken not to disturb the root systems of the soybeans still alive, fewer than she'd have liked by the first week of August. She assembled the main line from the stacked pipe behind the barn, working with the aluminum lateral for the longest sections, and stepping down to PVC at the branch connections, using the couplers she'd collected and the ones she'd bought with a portion of the egg money. The fittings were mismatched the way you'd expect from material gathered across a county over a summer, but mismatched was workable as long as the connections were tight. She wrapped each joint with plumber's tape the first time she assembled them, taking care to seat each coupling past its first thread. She thought she'd done it right. She found out she hadn't. The collector basin was the piece she was proudest of, a simple box lined with a section of old pond liner she'd found folded behind the seed shed routed, so its outlet connected directly to the top of the main line, fitted with a gate valve she could open by turning. The idea let water accumulate in the basin from the seep until it was full enough to give the line a decent head, then open the valve and let gravity do what she'd spent the summer setting up the conditions for. The night before the first test, she went over every joint by lantern light, starting at the collector and working down to the drip tape connections. The lantern threw yellow light and cast confusing shadows. She was tired in a way she hadn't fully acknowledged until the adrenaline of the moment made the tiredness feel irrelevant. She checked every coupling, pressing each joint with her thumb, confirming they were seated. She thought they were ready. Lena found her in the gray light of 5:30, crouched at the collector basin, with both hands pressed flat on its side, feeling the seep come through the liner. The basin had accumulated about 4 inches overnight. Wren had calculated it was enough. She heard Lena in the wet grass behind her, turned, expected to have to explain, but Lena just walked past her to a spot a few feet away and sat down cross-legged in her nightgown and hugged her knees and made clear she was there as witness, which was different from being in the way. Wren was glad not to be doing this entirely alone. She turned back to the valve. She said something under her breath that might have been a prayer. She turned the valve. The water moved. She heard it enter the main line, a sound like a conversation starting liquid, finding its direction, and for 4 or 5 seconds, the whole system pulled together exactly as she'd imagined, and something in her chest rose so fast it was almost painful. Then the first joint let go. A dark stain bloomed in the dirt at the first coupling below the collector. Before she could move a second one 10 feet further down, a third past that. The water found every weak seam and chose the seam over the destination and by the time whatever remained reached the drip tape, there was no pressure left. The emitters sat dry. The water she'd built the whole summer around sat uselessly in the dirt at her boots. She crouched there a while. Lena came and stood beside her and looked at the wet soil. "Is it broke?" Wren studied the stains, the pattern of them, the way each one located itself at a joint. She could have said yes. In the literal sense, it was accurate. The water had not reached the field. She had failed on the first attempt. Both things were true, and the weight of them settled on her shoulders like something she'd been carrying further than she knew. But she looked at the joints. She looked at where the failures were. Information, she thought. It's not broken. It's showing me exactly where I cut corners. She stood, wiped her face with the back of her arm, reached into her pocket for the roll of plumber's tape. She looked at Lena. "Hand me the wrench when I ask for it." Lena stood up very straight as if commissioned. She started back up the line to the first joint. She was going to wrap every coupling, every single one, from the collector to the end of the branch lines, 2 full wraps each, the way the installation pamphlet specified a step she'd abbreviated the first time because she'd been moving fast. The instructions had seemed conservative. They were not conservative. They were correct. The difference had just cost her a morning. She worked her way down the line over 2 full days, Lena appearing each morning with the punctuality of a child who has decided this is the most important thing happening anywhere. The rewrapping was painstaking. Wren did it correctly this time, seating each coupling fully before turning the tape, checking thread engagement by feel, then by sight. Her knees ached. The August sun was unreasonable by 8 in the morning. She developed a sunburn on the back of her neck that she forgot about until she lay down at night and felt the heat of it against the pillow. She ran the line again on the third morning. The joints held. The water moved from the collector to the branch lines without losing itself in the soil. Wren walked the length of it on her hands and knees, watching the emitters. The first half dozen gave water slow, deliberate, each one producing a small dark stain in the soil moisture, going straight to where the roots were. She kept moving. At the halfway point, the emitters gave less. Past that, noticeably less. At the far end of the run, nothing. She sat back on her heels and looked at the tail end of the row. The drip tape dry, the plants most desperate, the soil most cracked. Some plants had gotten water. Everything past the midpoint had watched her deliver it to their neighbors. She sat there longer than she'd sat after the first failure because this was a different kind of problem. The water was moving, the joints were holding, the system was working in the part of the field closest to the supply and dying out before it reached the part that needed it most. She got up and found the pamphlets. The answer was on the page she'd skimmed. She sat at Vera's kitchen table and read it twice, then closed the pamphlet and looked at the wall. The main line was too narrow. She'd built the entire system with pipe gathered from ditches, and ditch pipe tended toward the same diameter because it had all been irrigation lateral from the same era of equipment designed to come off a main supply that did the pressure work, not to carry the full load alone. She needed something wider at the top of the system, something that could hold a reserve of pressure at the head and release it evenly all the way to the end of the run. She did not have wider pipe. She'd gathered everything within range. She thought about that for a day. She thought about it while she was feeding the hens, while she was eating supper, while she lay in her bed listening to the night sounds of the farm. Then she remembered something Rigsby had said on his second visit, a casual reference to a vegetable operation that had shut down when the price dropped, a man who'd gotten out in 2009 and left everything in his barn because hauling it off would have cost more than it was worth. She remembered the name, Dale Pruitt. She knew the road he lived on because Rigsby had mentioned it in the same breath as the directions he'd used to get to the farm. She'd find the barn. Barns in this county announced themselves. She still had egg money. She was prepared to trade whatever narrow pipe remained from her collection straight across, if that was what it took. But first she was going to show Dale Pruitt the drawing, explain the system. Hope that an old farmer who'd spent 20 years running a commercial vegetable operation and had 3 barns worth of irrigation equipment going to rust had enough left in him to look at a 13-year-old girl's notebook and recognize something worth more than the cost of being generous. She was ready to find out. The tin roof ticked as the house cooled. The upper field was quiet in the dark. Somewhere below it, in the bottom of the draw, the seep was moving slow, patient, indifferent to the season, pushing moisture through a clay floor into a basin she dug with her hands, waiting for the line that was almost ready to carry it where it needed to go. She lay in her bed with her notebook open on her chest lamp off and thought 9 feet is enough. It has always been enough. She just needed the right pipe to prove it. She left before sunrise the next morning with the notebook in her front basket and the drawing folded inside the cover. The road to Dale Pruitt's place ran east off the county blacktop along a stretch where the tree line came close on both sides, and the gravel was the old kind packed clay underneath with stone on top. The kind of road that held its shape through dry summers because it had been laid by someone who understood what dry summers did to roads. She'd found the address through the only method available to her, asking Vera, who knew where everyone in the county had lived for the past 50 years and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Third farm past the crossroads, Vera had said. Red tin roof barn bigger than the house. You'll know it. She knew it. The barn sat back from the road at the end of a track that had been gravel once and was now mostly in tension, a metal structure with a peaked roof gone, the particular rust red of iron left to weather for a decade, the kind of building that looks abandoned until you get close enough to see the doors are hung correctly and the padlock is a good one. The farmhouse beyond it was a white-painted block structure with a concrete porch plain as a statement of fact, surrounded by the remnants of what had once been a serious windbreak planting on the north side cedars, and Osage orange gone leggy and unpruned but still standing. Dale Pruitt came out the front door before she reached the porch, which meant he'd been watching from inside long enough to form an opinion about a bicycle coming up his track. He was a large man in his mid-60s, built the way farmers of a certain generation were built, thick through the chest, carrying weight around the middle, that came from decades of eating well because the work required it, with a face that had been in the weather long enough to record every year of it. He had his thumbs in his overall straps, and he looked at Wren the way he might have looked at a piece of equipment he hadn't seen before and wasn't sure had a practical application. She got off her bike and walked it the last 20 feet. Mr. Pruitt, she'd practiced the opening on the ride over. My name is Wren Hallett. I farm on the Hallett place on the county road west of here. I came because Holt Rigsby mentioned you had irrigation equipment in your barn from when you ran the vegetable operation, and I need wider main line than I've been able to find. I thought you might be willing to deal. He looked at her for a long moment. Nothing in his face changed exactly, but something shifted in it, the way a man's face shifts when he's decided to listen instead of dismiss. Rigsby send you? No, sir. He mentioned your name in passing. I came on my own. Dale Pruitt unhooked his thumbs from his straps. Come up, he said, and turned back toward the door. Tell me what you need. She followed him into the kitchen of a man who lived alone and had been living alone long enough to work out a system, everything in its place, nothing surplus, the counter clear, except for a coffee maker and a single mug. He poured himself a second cup without offering her one, which she took as a sign he was treating her like someone with business to discuss rather than a child to be hosted. That was the more useful of the two options. She put the notebook on the table and opened it to the drawing. He looked at it without touching it. He looked longer than she expected, which was itself information. Men who didn't understand what they were looking at either asked immediately or dismissed immediately. He was doing neither. Tell me the problem, he said. She told him. She started with the seep and the draw and the 9 feet of fall, and she told him about the drip tape in the main line she'd assembled from salvage, and she told him about the first failure and the joint repairs, and she told him about the second failure, the system running out of pressure before it reached the end of the rows. She told it plainly without apology, describing each failure with the same tone she used for the facts that had worked, because they were all part of the same thing. She put her finger on the drawing where the main line narrowed at the branch connections and explained what she thought was happening to the pressure in that section. Dale Pruitt set his coffee cup down. Say that part again, his voice careful and quiet. About the diameter. She said it again. How the water was spending itself in the narrowest section of the run, arriving at the far end with nothing left to push through the emitters. How she needed to step up the main line diameter at the collection point to build a pressure reserve, then step back down at the branch connections to meter the flow evenly across the whole length. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough for her to wonder if she'd gotten it wrong, if she'd misread the pamphlet, if the confidence she'd brought to this kitchen table was about to come apart in front of a man she didn't know. That's exactly right, he said. The words came out the way a man speaks when he's confirmed something he thought he already knew. Took me 3 seasons to work that out, and it took a man from the state extension to explain it. He looked at her across the table. "How old are you?" she told him. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the drawing again, then at her face, with the expression of a man revising something quietly without announcement. He took her to the barn. It was larger inside than it looked from the road, which was itself a function of the way it had been filled systematically by a man who knew what he had and where he'd put it. Irrigation equipment ran the length of the left wall, stacked in order by type and size. Wide main line in the back. Aluminum lateral in the middle section. Fittings and labeled bins along the front wall. Drip tape rolled on wooden spools he'd built himself dry and still usable. The kind of equipment that kept if you stored it right. Wren stood in the doorway and looked at it. She offered the trade first, her salvaged narrow pipe straight across for the wide main line. She needed 2 lengths and the fittings to connect them. Dale Pruitt waved it off. "I'm not charging you for it," he said. "Take what you need." He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite respect, but occupied the space between them. "I just want to know if it works. Come back and tell me. That's my price." She loaded the pipe herself, carrying each length from the rack to the barn door, then walking it out to her wagon, loading it with the care you give material that has to survive the trip. Dale Pruitt watched from the doorframe, not offering to help, not commenting on the fact that she was moving pipe built for a man's strength, with the particular efficiency of someone who has run out of options other than doing the work. When she tied the last length down and thanked him, he gave her a nod. "Come back and tell me," he said again, like a man making a specific request, not offering a pleasantry. She told him she would. She meant it. The ride home took longer with the loaded wagon, the wide pipe sticking out behind and catching the morning air. She kept to the gravel shoulders where the track was smoother. The heat was coming up serious by the time she turned onto the county road, the sky gone from blue to white at the edges, in the way it went when the temperature was building toward the kind of afternoon that made you wonder if the air itself had given up. She rode through it without thinking about it. She was thinking about the new line and where she'd have to cut the existing main to splice in the wider section, and the coupling she'd need to step down from the new diameter back to the branch connections, and whether the plumber's tape she had left was enough or whether she needed to stop in town. She needed to stop in town. She had enough egg money. She rebuilt the main line over 5 days, starting from the collector basin and working down the slope. The wide pipe went in first 2 8-foot sections running from the basin to a junction point she calculated as the spot where the pressure had been adequate on the second attempt. She'd marked it with a stake, a piece of orange surveyor's tape from the seed shed. Below the junction, she stepped back down to the salvage pipe, but wider at the branch connections than she'd used before, which meant adapters she'd bought in town and fitted with the attention she'd learned was the only attention that mattered at a joint. Garrett came out on the second evening. She heard him cross the upper field behind her while she was packing the junction, fitting both hands on the coupling, turning it with slow, even pressure. She didn't turn around. She heard him stop about 10 feet back. She kept working. He stood there long enough that she finished the junction and capped it and moved to the next section before she said anything. "You can look at the drawing if you want," she said. "It's in the notebook on the stake." Silence. Then the sound of him picking it up. Pages turning. He stayed another 10 minutes without speaking, long enough for her to work 2 more sections before the light went too flat to see the threads clearly. When she finally turned around, he was standing with the notebook still open, looking at the slope from the collector down to where the branch lines began. His face was doing the thing it did when he was working through arithmetic. He handed her the notebook without comment. Then he went to the shed, came back with a spade, walked to the next section of trench she'd marked with stakes and started widening it. The new pipe was wider than what had been in the ground, and the trench needed to accommodate it, a problem he could see without being told. They worked until dark. He didn't say anything about the system. He didn't ask about the drawing or the collector basin or where the wide pipe had come from. He just dug the trench to the dimension it needed to be moving along the slope at the pace she set, stopping when she stopped to check a grade or fit a section. It was the first time he'd been in this field doing something she'd designed, and that fact sat between them in the air as something that didn't need to be named. When the light was truly gone, he put the spade over his shoulder and walked toward the house. At the fence line, he stopped. Don't work past what you can see, he said. You'll miss something you'll need later. She said she understood. He went inside. She stood in the field after he left in the full dark with the upper field around her, the soybeans invisible but present. She thought about what his being here meant, what the spade meant, what the hour of silent work beside her meant, in the particular language her father spoke when words were not available to him. It meant something. She was old enough to know it. She went in and ate the supper Dottie had left covered on the stove. Dottie came through the kitchen while she was eating and didn't ask where she'd been or what she was doing, only paused behind her and rested one hand for a moment on the top of her head, the weight of it for 3 seconds, and then Dottie went down the hall to put Lena to bed. Wren sat with her supper and felt the warmth of that hand in her hair long after it was gone. In the way small things stay when everything else is moving too fast to hold. She finished the rebuild on the following morning and ran the line again at first light with Lena present as contracted. The joints held. The water entered the wide main line with more force than she'd heard before, a sound with weight behind it. She followed the system's progress by sound alone for the first 30 feet, then moved to the junction and crouched and pressed her hand to the coupling and felt the vibration of pressure moving through it. The coupling was holding. The step-down fittings at the branch connections were holding. The water entered the branch lines and began its work. She followed it on her hands and knees along the first row face close to the ground, watching the emitters. The first one gave water dark and immediate, a small spreading stain in the cracked soil. The second, the third. She kept moving. At the halfway point, she slowed down because this was where the second attempt had started to fail, where the pressure had dropped to nothing. The emitters kept working. She moved past the halfway point, past the spot she'd marked as the edge of success on the last attempt, and the emitters were still giving, each one darkening the soil in the same slow, deliberate way, delivering what the plants had been waiting for directly to where the roots were. She reached the 3/4 mark. She reached the spot 80 feet down the row where the drip tape had been completely dry on the second attempt. The emitter there was wet. She kept moving toward the tail end of the row, the last 20 feet, where the most desperate plants stood in the driest soil, where the cracking was worst, the leaves so pale they were nearly white. She was almost afraid to look. She moved toward it anyway. Garrett was at the top of the trench. She hadn't heard him come out, didn't know when he'd arrived or how long he'd been watching. She could feel his presence the way she'd learned to feel at a particular weight in the air above her. She didn't look up. She looked at the last emitter in the run, the one at the far end of the tail row, the end of everything she'd built. It was dark, not with shadow, with moisture. The soil around the fitting had gone dark in the specific way soil goes dark when something is feeding it from below, and as she watched, the emitter gave a single bead of water that swelled at the hole and dropped into the dirt and vanished. Then another, then steady. She sat back on her heels. She didn't shout. There was nothing in her that wanted to shout. What was in her was something quieter and more complete, a feeling that took up the whole inside of her chest without being loud about it. The feeling of a proof that had been costing her all summer finally coming out correct. She stayed on her knees in the dirt at the end of the row and pressed both palms flat against the ground on either side of the drip tape and felt the moisture coming up through the soil from below. The evidence of the thing she'd built working as designed water. Finding the roots the way water finds everything it's meant to find when you give it the right path. The soil was cool under her hands. In the 3rd August of a drought, with the sun already coming up hard over the slope, the soil at the end of that row was cool. She pressed her hands flat and held still. Above her at the top of the trench, Garrett stood with his arms at his sides. She heard the slight shift of his weight. She knew without looking he was watching the end of the row, watching the dark stains spreading slowly outward from each emitter in the tail section, watching water arrive in a place it had never reliably arrived in the 30 years this family had been trying to farm the upper field. She didn't look up. She wasn't ready for whatever was in his face. She stayed with her hands in the soil for a long time. What she felt wasn't triumph. Triumph had an edge to it, a direction, something pointing at something else. This was more like an ending that turned out to be structural. Not a wall you hit, but a floor you finally found. All summer, she'd been building toward a point where the system would either prove out or it wouldn't. And now she had the answer, and the answer was sitting in the soil under her hands, cool and certain. She didn't know yet about her grandfather. She didn't know about 1983, or the trench he'd filled, or the men who had laughed and the pride that had cost him everything that followed. She knew only what was in her hands at that moment, the cool of the soil, the slow work of the emitters, the proof that 9 feet was exactly enough. She got up, brushed the soil off her palms, walked back up the row past her father without meeting his eyes, went to the collector basin, checked the gate valve, noted the water level, made a note in her notebook about the flow rate in the time. Garrett was still standing at the top of the trench when she finished writing. She capped her pen and looked up at him. He unfolded his arms. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully name, something older than the arithmetic look, something from a different summer than this one. Then he looked out over the upper field at the 2 rows where the soil was dark and the plants were already standing differently. A subtle shift in posture that a farmer would read correctly as a plant that has received something it had been rationing against. He looked at those rows for a long time. Think you could run it out to the east field too? A question. Not a directive, not an observation. A question directed at her, requesting her assessment, her knowledge, her answer, the first time in her memory that Garrett Hallett had looked at his middle child and asked what she thought instead of telling her what to do. She turned her face back toward the emitters so he wouldn't see it. Yeah, she said to the dirt. I think I could. He stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man making a note of something, and walked back toward the house. She listened to his boots on the dry ground, the sound of him getting smaller, and she stayed where she was with the notebook in her hand and the morning sun on her back and the upper field going about its slow recovery around her. Holt Rigsby came back in the first week of September. He walked the main line from the collector basin to the tail row with a measuring wheel and a fresh clipboard, asking questions with the specific attentiveness of a man who has been surprised by something and isn't sure yet what category to put it in. He crouched at the collector basin, examined the seep feeding the liner, asked about the clay floor and the spring source. She explained. He took notes. He asked about the wide main line and the step down at the branches, and she walked him through the pressure logic. He examined the tail row emitters working for 3 weeks by then. That end of the field turned into the best-looking soybeans in the county. He stayed 2 hours. When he was done, he stood at the head of the run and looked at the system as a whole. The slope, the collector, the line running down the drip tape branching into the rows, and he tucked the clipboard under his arm. Built this yourself? The careful flatness was gone from his voice. She said she'd had some help with the pipe. She didn't mention that the core of it had come from reading his office's own extension pamphlets, the ones his predecessors had written in decades when this kind of system was standard knowledge. That seemed like something to hold back, not from strategy, but from the same instinct that had kept her from telling anyone about the seep until she'd proven it was real. I'd like to bring someone out in the spring, Rigsby said. Engineering student from the university. He ought to see this. He paused, working through something, the habit of a man who spent his professional life calibrating expectations against reality and had just found a significant gap between the two. This is the kind of thing people study, he said. What you built here, she nodded. He walked back to his truck and she watched him go with the feeling of someone who has been measured by an instrument that wasn't calibrated for what it found. October came in dry and bright, the way October comes in Tennessee when the summer has taken everything and the fall arrives with clarity as compensation. The upper field by the 3rd week of the month was the color of something that had made a decision. The soybeans stood dense, the canopy closing over the soil between the rows, the leaves turned up as if they had something to show. The pods were fat and heavy, loaded the way pods load when a plant has had everything it needed through the whole growing season and nothing has been rationed. In the rows next door on the Hallett ground, the drip line hadn't reached yet on the neighboring farms visible across the fence line. The soybeans told a different story, pale and thin, carrying the particular resignation of a crop that has given what it had. The first neighbor arrived on a Tuesday. A pickup she didn't recognize turned off the county road and came down the track slowly, the way people drive when they're looking at something, and parked at the field edge. A man got out who she knew by sight, one of the farmers who'd given her pipe from his fence line back in June. He stood at the field's edge and looked at the upper section before walking toward where Wren was adjusting an emitter at the head of row 3. He walked the length of the first row, the way farmers walk rows, checking at intervals, pressing his boot into the soil between plants, looking at the canopy from the side to judge density. He crouched at the end of the row and pressed 2 fingers into the soil, a different gesture from Garrett's more evaluating than reading, and when he stood back up, he looked at her. "What'd you do different?" His voice was plain, the tone of a question asked in good faith by someone who has run out of theories. She walked him through it. Not the whole summer, just the system, just the how of it. The seep, the gravity, the wide main line, the drip emitters going straight to the root zone instead of throwing water into the air. She showed him the tail row emitters, which always surprised people, that farthest point where failure had been most complete and recovery was now most obvious. He looked at the tail row plants for a long time. Then he pulled a pod and split it with his thumbnail and rolled the beans into his palm. He pressed one with his thumb. Full firm, the kind of beans that October fields weren't producing this year, that almost nowhere in the county were producing. He looked at what was in his hand. Then he lifted his eyes to the 13-year-old girl standing at the edge of the field, with dirt dried on her boots, and asked his second question the same way he'd asked his first, without theater, without anything extra. Whether she'd be willing to come out and help him set something similar up before the next planting season. Not as a favor, as a job. More came over the following week. Some in pairs, some alone, arriving in the late afternoon when the light was good for seeing the color of a field. They walked the rows, crouched at the emitters, pressed the soil. Did the arithmetic that the evidence was making unavoidable. Wren walked each group through the system the same way she'd walked the first man, without gloating, because it wasn't in her. Because the field said everything that needed to be said, and she just needed to explain the mechanism. She showed them the seep and the slope and the drip tape, and she let the soil under the plants speak for itself. She was crouching at the tail end of a row, showing 2 of the older neighbors the emitter pattern, when she felt someone behind her and turned. Cord was standing at the edge of the row with a wrench in his hand. Not making a production of it, he'd come from the direction of the barn carrying the tool, the way he always carried tools, loose and without ceremony. He looked past her at the field, at the standing green of it against the pale afternoon sky, and something moved across his face that she'd never seen there before. Not regret. Something less organized than that. More like the feeling of having been in the wrong room when something important happened and knowing it. He held the wrench out, the right size for the emitter fitting. She'd been about to tighten the one she'd been fumbling for. She looked at it, looked at him. He looked away out over the green field. She took the wrench, turned back to the row. When she turned around again, Cord was gone, and she heard the barn door from across the field. She tightened the fitting and moved to the next one. The neighbors asked her before they left whether she'd come out and help them set up something similar before the next planting season. Several asked at once, standing at the field edge in the October light, the same men who'd handed her their old pipe in June and watched her load it, with the soft laughter of people watching something they didn't understand. The laughter was gone. What had replaced it took longer to arrive and lasted longer once it arrived. She told them she would. She walked back up the slope after they left, through the rows she'd watered all summer with salvage pipe and egg money, and the stubbornness that looks like patience from a distance. The late sun came in low and sideways the way it came in October, turning everything it touched the color of something old and valuable. She walked through it with her notebook under her arm and her boots dark at the toes from the moisture at the field edge. And she was already thinking about the east field, the grades and draws. The longer run required the additional pipe she'd need. She stopped at the lip of the draw and looked down at the collector basin, which was full. The seep had been running 3 weeks without interruption, fed by whatever underground thread kept it going, even in the driest fall in memory. The water sat in the basin, quiet and dark, exactly where she'd said it would be, up high, ready to fall. The water doesn't care what you paid for the pipe. She thought it without meaning to, standing there at the draw in the fading light. It was the simplest version of everything she'd learned that summer. The thing underneath all the pamphlet diagrams and pressure calculations and failed joints. Water didn't care about salvage or egg money or a girl nobody had thought to ask. It only cared about one thing, and she'd spent a summer giving it exactly that. She stood there until the light went flat. Then she turned and walked toward the house. The soybeans in the upper field were a different color than everything around them, and by the 3rd week of October, everyone who drove the county road had to reckon with that fact. You didn't need to stop to see it. The Hallett upper field sat dense and dark green against the pale, exhausted fields on either side, a color difference visible from the blacktop readable from a truck window at 40 miles an hour. Most of them stopped anyway. Garrett walked the border between the irrigated rows and the unirrigated ones twice before he said a word about it. Once in the morning before the family was up in the flat gray light of early October when the dew was still on everything. Once in the evening when the light came in sideways and showed the contrast at its most severe. Wren knew he'd been walking that border because she could see his boot prints in the soil at the edge of the drip line's reach, the clear line where the dark, moist ground ended and the cracked pale ground began as legible as a sentence. He came to find her on a Thursday afternoon when she was flat on her belly at the head of row 3, one arm in the trench adjusting an emitter that had drifted off its mark. She heard him coming across the field and felt the familiar weight of his attention before he spoke. "How much water is this thing pulling?" His voice was the voice he used for equipment assessments, flat and specific, asking for a number. She gave him one. The flow rate from the collector, the hours per day, the system ran the estimated gallons per plant per week. She'd been logging it in the notebook since the first week of September because she'd known someone would ask eventually, and she wanted the answer to be precise. He crouched beside the row. He reached down and worked 2 fingers into the soil between the plants and held them there, not the quick check of a man confirming what he already suspects, but the longer hold of a man reading something he hasn't felt before. The soil was cool and damp, 4 inches down, dark at the surface, even in the middle of a dry October afternoon. He stayed crouched there a long moment. "Then think you could run it out to the east field too." She turned her face back toward the emitter. "Yeah," she said to the dirt. "I think I could." She heard him stand. She heard him take one more look at the row, his attention moving down the line toward the tail section where the plants that had been closest to dying were now the most obviously alive. Then his boots on the dry ground, the sound of him getting smaller. She stayed in the row after he left, arms still in the trench, fingers on the emitter fitting she'd stopped pretending to adjust. The east field. She'd been mapping it in her head for 3 weeks, the grades, the draw on the north side with its own low catch the longer run required. She'd been ready for that question before he asked it. What she hadn't been ready for was how it would feel to be asked. She pressed her palm flat against the soil at the base of the plant nearest to her. The roots were down there somewhere doing their work in the dark, and the damp not requiring anyone to witness them. She thought about that for a moment, how much of the important work happened where nobody could see it. She got up and went to find Vera. Her grandmother was at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, the pamphlet spread in front of her in the particular fan pattern that meant she'd been reading and rereading, not searching for something new, but returning to something she already knew. The coffee cup at her elbow had gone cold. Wren came in through the back door, pulled out the chair across from her, sat down. Let it come out in a rush, the system working every emitter down to the tail row, her father crouching in the soil. The question about the east field. She expected Vera to be satisfied. She expected the small nod, the dry half smile, some acknowledgement that the thing had gone the way both of them had understood it would go. Vera listened with her hands folded and her face quiet. When Wren finished, she didn't say congratulations. She sat looking at the pamphlet spread under the lamp, and something in her expression moved the way something moves under still water when there's current below the surface. "You ever wonder," she said, "why an old woman keeps a stack of farm papers 40 years past their use?" Wren had not wondered. She'd only ever been grateful they were there. Vera picked up the pamphlet on top of the stack and turned it around and slid it across the table, pointing to the inside of the front cover. Wren looked. Writing there, the same slow, careful hand she'd been finding in margins all summer, penciled light and faded but legible. A name, a year, and a line she hadn't seen before: Upperfield, North Draw. 1983. The clay floor holds. "Your granddaddy," Vera said. "Odell's father. He read every one of these, same as you've been doing all summer." She smoothed the old cover flat with 2 fingers slowly, the way she did everything that mattered. The summer of 1983, he ran pipe down off that same draw. Same seep. Same 9 feet of fall. He said he was going to water the high ground without a pump, and half the county drove out to watch him prove it. Wren had gone very still. "He was a proud man," Vera continued. "Prouder than was practical, and he couldn't stand the thought of being made a fool of." She paused. "First run it leaked. 3 joints right below the collector. Same as yours. The kitchen was quiet except for the tick of the stove cycling off. The men who'd come to watch Vera said they laughed. Not cruel about it, just the easy way men laugh at a thing they've already decided can't be done. She looked at the pamphlet, not at Wren. He was a proud man, and he pulled every foot of that pipe back out of the ground himself, filled the trench in by hand so there'd be nothing left to point at, and he never spoke of it again as long as he lived. Wren found her voice small. Then why'd you keep his papers? Vera looked at her across the table for a long moment before she answered. Because he was right. The word landed quietly and completely. He was right, Wren. One leaking joint away from right, and he let a field full of grown men talk him out of it. I watched that happen to a good man, and I couldn't talk him back. She reached over and put one finger on the pamphlet. This spring I watched his granddaughter start looking at the water the same way he used to. So I put the right papers on top and kept my mouth shut and let you find it on your own. She stopped. The stove ticked once more in the silence. Because a thing you find on your own, nobody can laugh you out of it. Wren sat with that. She looked at the handwriting in the cover of the pamphlet, the same hand she'd been reading in margins all summer, the hand she'd recognized in June and traced with her finger in the early morning dark. She understood something she hadn't understood before. Those notes weren't the record of a man who had failed. They were the record of a man who had been right and hadn't been able to hold on to it. The difference between those two things had nothing to do with the pipe or the seep or the 9 feet of fall. It had to do with what you did when the first joints leaked and whether you wrapped them and opened the valve again. She understood something else then, something about her father. She understood the saying she'd heard him repeat her whole life, always in the same words, that high ground's been beating this family since before I was born. Some ground just wins. Understood it now, not as wisdom, not as fatalism, but as the sound a wound makes when it's been covered for 30 years. Garrett had been about her age in 1983, old enough to stand in the field and watch his father give up fill the trench, walk back to the house without speaking. He hadn't been afraid Wren would fail. He'd been afraid she would win, because winning meant the ground could have been watered 30 years ago. Winning meant the thing his father had stopped believing in had been real all along, had always been real, sitting right there in the draw, waiting for someone willing to fail twice and try a third time. She sat at the table a long while. Vera didn't move her along. The lamp burned between them, the pamphlet spread in the small circle of its light, and outside the window, the upper field was invisible in the dark, present only as a direction. Eventually, Wren reached across the table and put her hand over her grandmother's folded hands. Vera's hands were small and cool, and very still, the hands of a woman who had held a great many things and learned the particular stillness of someone who knows the difference between holding on and holding. They sat like that a minute without speaking. The lamp made a circle around the table, and the two of them, and outside it, the rest of the house went about its evening. The newspaper woman came out the following week. Janelle Odom from the county paper, driving a Civic with a camera bag in the back seat, a woman in her 30s with the alertness of someone whose job required her to find the interesting thing before someone else explained it away. She'd heard about the field from someone Wren never established, had called Rigsby, who confirmed enough to make the drive worthwhile. She walked the system with Wren for an hour before she took a single photograph. She asked about the seep and the drip tape and where the pipe had come from, and Wren told her plainly and in order, and Janelle Odom wrote it all down with the focused attention of someone who understands that the details are the story, not the frame around it. When she asked how old Wren was, Wren told her 13. Janelle looked up from her notebook. She looked at the field, at the collector basin, at the branch lines running down the rows to the tail section. She looked back at Wren and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she took her camera out of the bag. The piece ran on the front page below the fold with a photograph of the upper field taken from the slope, looking down, the color contrast between the irrigated rows and everything beyond them, visible even in newsprint. The headline called Wren a young innovator, which she found mortifying in the specific way that accurate descriptions can be mortifying when they don't quite fit how you think of yourself. She had not been thinking of herself as an innovator. She'd been thinking of herself as someone trying to solve a specific problem with the materials available to her. She asked Dottie please not to hang it on the refrigerator. Dottie hung it on the refrigerator. Cord saw it there the morning after it went up. He stood in front of the refrigerator reading it, his back to the kitchen, and Wren at the table with her coffee and the Eastfield drawings watched him from behind and couldn't see his face. He stood long enough to have read it twice. Then he opened the refrigerator and got what he'd come for and went back out to the shed without saying anything. 2 days later, he came into the barn while she was working on the Eastfield pipe calculations spread out on the barn floor in the order she planned to assemble them. He crouched at the far end of the layout and looked at the wider main line section from Dale Pruitt's barn. "That's going to need a longer run at the top," he said, pointing at the junction she designed. "If the east field's longer than the upper field by the distance, you said you'll run out of pressure reserve before you hit the midpoint." She looked at where he was pointing. She looked at her notebook. He was right, and she'd known he was right, had been planning to address it with a second collector basin further along the main line. She just hadn't explained that to the drawing yet. "I know," she said. "I'm adding a second collector at the grade break." He looked at the drawing for another moment, nodded once, the nod of someone who has checked something and found it in order. Went back out. Not an apology. She didn't need it to be. She went out to the east field that same afternoon to confirm the grade on the north side, the catch basin position near the old fence corner, the seep she'd found at the far end of the east draw. She'd confirmed that seep the same way she'd confirmed the first one, on her knees in the driest week of September, digging with her hands, waiting, coming back to find water standing in the hole. 2 seeps on the same property, both on clay floors, both feeding draws the family had walked past for generations, treating them as seasonal inconveniences. She took that to Dale Pruitt on her second visit when she went back to report as she'd promised. He was sitting on his porch when she rode up, and he came down the steps before she'd finished parking the bike. "Well," his voice unhurried, but only technically. She told him it had worked. The tail row emitters, the soil moisture, the field color. She told him about her father crouching in the soil and asking about the east field. She told him about the second seep. He stood at the bottom of his porch steps and looked at her for a moment with the recalibrating expression she'd seen at the kitchen table on her first visit. "2 of them," he said. "On the same property," she said. "Same clay geology. I think there might be more if the formation runs northeast." He looked off down his drive toward the road, the posture of a man doing arithmetic. Then he looked back at her. "Come inside," he said. "I've got the site maps from when I had the operation running. You should see what the drainage survey shows about that clay layer." They spent 2 hours at his kitchen table with the maps spread out. Dale Pruitt showed her things about the subsurface geology of that corner of Hardeman County that no one had thought to explain to her before. The clay formation that held the seep on the Hallett property ran northeast across 4 farms before it deepened below the water table. Every property along that line had a draw. Every draw had the same potential. She wrote it all down, left with 2 rolls of wide main line from the back of his barn, loaded herself, tied down herself, thanked him on the porch. He stood on his steps with his coffee and looked at the maps rolled under her arm. "You're going to help those neighbors, aren't you?" he said. "The ones who came to look?" "Yes, sir." He nodded slow. "Good," he said. "That's the right use of a thing like this." She spent the winter drawing the East Field system in the evenings at the kitchen table, sometimes with Vera nearby, sometimes alone. She drew it by hand in the notebook, then transferred it to graph paper she'd bought in town, working out the grades and junction points and collector positions with the same method she'd used on the upper field, one confirmed piece at a time, each decision written down before the next one was made. She ordered the wide main line from Pruitt's second barn visit in November, storing it in the equipment shed where Garrett had quietly made space for it without being asked. Garrett told her the rest of 1983 on an evening in late March, when the light was long and thin and the east field work was far enough along that the first test run was 2 weeks away. He came out while she was checking grade. On the second collector basin, stood at the edge of the excavation, with his hands in his jacket pockets, watched her work for a while without speaking. Then he said, "I was 12 that summer." She stopped. Didn't look up yet. He'd watched from the fence line, he said. His father had been careful about the project, quiet about it, the way he was quiet about everything he cared about. Spent the spring reading, the summer measuring, had the line laid, and the collector dug by August. The neighbors had come to see it because the word had traveled. Garrett had stood at the fence in August of 1983 and watched his father open the valve for the first time. The joints had gone in less than a minute, Garrett said, his voice flat, the voice he used for facts. 3 of them right below the collector. The men who'd come to watch had laughed, and his father's face had done something Garrett had never seen it do before or after. He'd pulled the pipe out himself over the next 2 days. Wouldn't let anyone help. Filled the trench with the same spade he dug it with. By the end of the second day, there was nothing left to show it had been there. He never said what it was, Garrett continued. Never named the idea, never mentioned he'd tried it. For a long time, I thought it was stubbornness. He paused, looking at the east field. Now I think it was something closer to grief. A man like that being wrong in front of people. He thought that was what had happened. Wren waited. He wasn't wrong, she said. Garrett looked at her. No, he said. He wasn't, just leaking. Something in that landed between them with a weight that wasn't painful. Heavy the way things are heavy when they've been stored a long time and are finally set down in the right place. She looked at her father's face and saw what she'd been trying to name since August, since that morning he'd crouched in the soil of the upper field, with his fingers reading the moisture she'd put there. It wasn't complicated. It was a man standing on the other side of something he'd been afraid of for 30 years, and the other side turned out to be solid ground. She picked up her spade. She had grade to check. The East Field test ran on a morning in early April. Dale Pruitt at the upper collector, Garrett at the junction between the two main line sections, ran at the far end of the longest run where the second collector fed the tail rows. She'd asked both of them to be there and position them herself the first time she'd positioned her father anywhere, and had it taken as a reasonable request. The valve opened at the top and she heard it through the system water entering the wide main line, the sound of pressure finding its direction. She watched the second collector fill to its activation depth and begin feeding the lower branch lines. She watched the first emitters darken in the tail rows. She walked the length of the last run, with her eyes on the soil, watching the dark stains appear one by one in the April dry ground. Nothing gave. The water ran the full length of both runs, reached every emitter in the system, even the last one on the east tail row 90 feet from the second collector, a distance that should have been at the edge of the pressure reserve she'd calculated. It wasn't at the edge. It was inside it. She'd calculated right. She stood at the end of the east tail row and looked back up the full length of it at the pipe and fittings she'd assembled over 4 months, at the two collectors feeding down through the grade, at the branch lines crossing the field, with their emitters giving water quietly into ground that had been dry since October. Dale Pruitt was visible at the far end by the upper collector. Garrett somewhere in the middle section. Both of them still. She crouched at the tail emitter and pressed her fingers into the soil around it. Cool. Wet at an inch. The east field clay held different than the upper field, tighter, slower to drain, which meant the water would stay longer per irrigation cycle, which meant she could run the system less frequently and still maintain the same moisture. She'd suspected that from the drainage maps. The confirmation was here under her fingers. She was working through the implications, the adjusted run schedule, the potential for extending the system further along the clay formation to the neighboring properties when she noticed that neither Garrett nor Dale Pruitt had moved. Both of them had stopped where they stood and were watching the tail row, watching her crouched in the dirt with her hand in the soil. She stood up, wiped her hands on her jeans. She looked at the east field in the early April light, the full length of it. The branch lines in orderly runs across the soil, the emitters doing their quiet work, the ground darkening in the complete pattern of a system delivering to its whole range. She'd built this, the whole of it, the reading, the measuring, the failing, the adjusting, the two collector basins and the step-down junctions in the 90 feet of tail row that was now wet in the driest spring anyone in Hardeman County could remember. She stood in the field and let herself feel that, not performing it for the men watching from either end, feeling it for herself in the private space of her own chest, where the summer had been accumulating since the morning she dug a hole in the draw with her hands and come back 4 hours later to find water standing in it. She breathed in once slow. Then she noticed something she hadn't let herself notice before, that her shoulders had been carrying something since June, a particular tension that had nothing to do with the digging or the pipe work or the early mornings, a tension that came from not knowing, from building toward a proof that might not prove out. She noticed it now because it was gone. The weight of the not knowing lifted. She stood in the east field in the early April light and felt for the first time since June, like the ground under her feet was simply the ground, Not a problem, not a test, not a thing that had been beating her family since before she was born. Just ground. Ground she understood. Garrett met her at the junction between the two main line sections when she walked back up the field. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at her with the expression she'd seen since August. The recalibrated one, steadier now, settled into something that looked in this particular light like a man who has stopped being afraid of something and discovered the thing he was afraid of had always been on his side. Dale Pruitt came down from the upper collector, taking his time on the slope, and stopped on Wren's other side. The three of them stood looking at the tail section at the dark soil around the last emitters at the east field, becoming a different color than the ground around it, visibly, undeniably the color of something that has what it needs. Dale reached into his jacket and brought out a folded piece of paper and held it out to Wren. She unfolded it. A copy of a section of the drainage survey map, the one showing the clay formation running northeast across 4 properties. He'd marked 3 more draws on it in pencil with question marks beside each one. Might be more seeps along that line, he said. She looked at the 3 question marks. She thought about the neighboring farms, the farmers who'd asked her to come out before the next planting season. She thought about the drainage survey and what it showed about the formation's direction. She folded the map and put it in her notebook. She went home. She poured herself a glass of water from the tap and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the upper field visible from there. If you look for it, the far slope showing its color even in the early season ground before the new planting. In 2 months, she'd be out there opening the system for the second season, checking emitters, adjusting the collector intake, doing the maintenance that was now simply part of how this farm ran. Dottie came through the kitchen and paused at the counter. She looked at Wren at the window, looked at the glass in her hand, looked at the field visible through the glass. Eastfield, she said. Ran to the last emitter, Wren said. Dottie reached past her, opened the cabinet above the counter, took out 2 cups, set them on the counter, started the coffee maker. She didn't say anything else. The 2 cups said the things she was saying, and it was enough. Lena came in from the back door with her barn boots on and her hair loose and mud on her knees. She wasn't going to explain, and she went to the table and sat down and looked at Wren with the expression she'd worn all fall and winter. The expression of a child who has witnessed something and has been waiting with genuine patience for the right moment to ask. "Did the far end work?" she said. "Yes," Wren said. Lena considered this with appropriate gravity. "Then can I come when you do the next one?" Wren looked at her. She thought about the question mark draws on Dale Pruitt's map, the 3 marked properties, the neighboring farms that had asked her to come out. She thought about what it was going to take, the measuring, the digging, the testing, the adjustment, the early mornings. She thought about Lina in her nightgown, in the wet grass of the draw, cross-legged in the dirt, holding tools, guarding the drip tape, with the seriousness of a commission properly given. "Yeah," she said. "You can come." Lena accepted this without drama because she'd been planning on it anyway. Vera was at the kitchen table that evening with a smaller stack, 3 pamphlets with a piece of string around them set in the center of the table where the lamp was brightest. Wren sat down across from her and looked at the stack. "What are these soil surveys?" Vera said. "County Extension published them in the 1990s. The good ones before they stopped doing field work." Wren untied the string and opened the top one. The date on the cover was 1994. Inside, the pages were clean, no margin notes, no careful hand adding numbers in pencil. Blank in the specific way a thing is blank when no one has used it yet. She picked up her pen. She wrote in the margin of the first page the date, the field name, the seep location, the gradient measurement, the clay depth confirmation from the east field test. Small, careful letters. Her own hand the same way she'd written everything that summer, one confirmed piece at a time. Then she looked at the cover at the top right corner where there was room. She wrote her name there. Wren Hallett, in the year and the same place her grandfather had written his name in the pamphlet that had started all of it. Same kind of pencil. New page. She closed the cover and put her hand flat on it, feeling the cardboard, the slight give of the pages underneath the weight of the survey, and the blank margins waiting. Dottie set a cup of coffee at her elbow. Lena had folded herself into the corner chair. Vera sat across from her in the lamplight, her own cup in her hands, watching with the expression of a woman who put the right papers on top of the stack and kept her mouth shut and let the right person find them. Outside the window, the upper field had gone dark. But Wren knew its geography now the way she knew her own, every grade, every draw, every emitter position, every place the water came from, and every place it went. The East Field the same way. 3 more draws on Dale Pruitt's map, question marks beside each one waiting. She lifted her hand from the cover of the pamphlet. She picked up her pen and opened to the first blank page and began to write.